All right. Good morning, everyone. We're very lucky to be sharing our Saturday with Professor Kaushik Basu from Cornell University. He's the professor of economics and C. Marks Professor of International Studies at Cornell. He's had a long, fascinating, and diverse career, also serving as Chief Economist of the World Bank from 2012 to 2016. And he served as the Chief Economic Advisor to the Indian government from 2009 to 2012. He's written over 20 books, including Beyond the Invisible Hand, A Groundwork for a New Economics, An Economist in the Real World, and also The Republic of Beliefs, which was published in 2018. So today we will discuss Reason to be Happy, his latest book. It's very engaging, thought-provoking, and shows us why thinking well can help us navigate everything from personal decisions to major global challenges. Now, the premise might sound simple to some, but I think everyone will encounter things in this book that will challenge them and help them engage with both obviously complex and deceptively simple topics in a new light. And the book is available in the UK now, and it'll be released in the US on August 6th this year. Welcome, Professor. We're so excited to have you today.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Alaka, I have a problem pronouncing her name because I discovered that we share the mother tongue. So I know exactly the way it's pronounced, but also the way originally pronounced and now. Alaka, thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you. So I wanted to start by talking about the book. The title is witty, and it hints that we have reason to be happy and that we should reason to be happy. And you've dedicated it to your students in the hope of a better world. Tell us a bit about why you decided to write this book and why it's important to write now.
The book was a very unexpected venture for me because most of my life is economics, economic policy making. And you were mentioning my other books. You would see that the bulk of them would be to do with pretty much mainstream economics. I am a critic of mainstream economics, but nevertheless, it was that. This particular book I stumbled onto in a very different way. Some 5 years ago, I began having a little bit of interaction with Cornell's philosophy department and getting into some issues where you bring logic and reason into everyday life. And that took me back. So there is a longer history to it, to my student days in London, when I was a student of economics, doing masters at the London School of Economics. But one of my professors, and there were others actually, one of my professors who straddled economics and philosophy, very prominent name, Amartya Sen, with whom I later on went on to do my PhD with Amartya later on, had a huge amount of interest in philosophy. And some of you will know that he was writing, contributing to mainstream philosophy journals like Mind and Analysis, Journal of Philosophy, etc. And I did get hooked onto that. And there was an even earlier interest from my days in Calcutta when I was growing up in school. I stumbled upon Bertrand Russell, which for me, maybe I'll have occasion to talk about later, really did change my perspective on a variety of things. And then, all that is the backdrop. Then about 5 years ago, when I began interacting with the philosophers, and I thought that it may be worthwhile for me to bring in some of my personal experiences with reason. And I do believe that a large part of human life and happiness comes from reasoning. What I say, Alaka, you've read the book, so you know right at the beginning, what I say is that, you know, when we grapple with psychological difficulties and problems, of course, very often you'll need counseling, you'll need medicines, etc. But there's also a huge amount. I really can't overemphasize the huge amount that you can do through reasoning by pausing. And in my book, again, I talk about my personal encounters with that. And, you know, logic has been of interest to me as an economist. My primary interest is in the logic, very fine reasoning of the discipline. So the book came out of that. And occasionally I hear people referring to it as a self-help book. I didn't write it as a self-help book. It's a bit in the spirit of the good life that the Greek philosophers talked about at length. So it's philosophy, analysis, logic for the good life. That's what the book is about. And at the tail end of the book, I begin with the individual, literally the single individual. Then I talk about groups, Greta's dilemma and things like that. We may get onto that later. And I end up with the world. What do we do with the very, very troubled world that we live in now? So that's really my entrance into the book and the project, the way it developed.
So how did your experiences in all of these diverse fields, both in economics, policy, teaching, how did that shape the way you decided to approach this book and structure it?
You know, the introspective part of me, as you would sense from the book, is very, very important. And when I was, I spent 7 years of my life in policy making, 3 years in the Indian government, and 4 years at the World Bank. And some of these are pretty tense contexts in which you're meeting, you're having discussions with politicians, taking critical decisions. One thing I discovered, people would say, do you get disturbed by these? There's a jostling, fighting. I discovered that I'm quite good at switching off at the end of the day. So I remember in the World Bank, it would be a day of arguing, bargaining, fighting, from petty things to big things. I would walk out of the building and I would switch off from that onto other things. It is true that I'm lucky. I've gone through difficult phases in my youth, but I'm lucky that I have this propensity. And then I have thought that one of the reasons why I have enjoyed my 7 years, some pretty dismal times objectively, I know the situation, the context, the kind of problems I was getting into, but the reason I enjoyed was throughout this ability to cut that off, get into reasoning, and I somehow keep feeling that it is possible. You know, my guru, the person intellectually I admire most, David Hume, great philosopher, but also a person of great calmness and very natural kind of calmness, where he would use his reasoning. I love some of the lines where he talks about the way he approaches a life. And I've taken that as a lesson. Hume is not someone I began with, but I stumbled upon Hume later on. And then I found that there are so many pieces of advice he's giving, which are very, very similar to what I would instinctively go for, that reinforced it and has been a part of me all through. And the book sort of sums up. The book is intertwining of very, very abstract pieces of logic. There's something called the incarceration game. If there's time, I will go into that. To personal matters and encountering problems and how I take them on.
Yeah, so let's start with some of the things at the beginning where good reasoning helps individuals navigate and arrive at a good life. And you've written that the capacity to reason is the most valued and the most underutilized of human faculties. And you also make an effort to distinguish good reasoning and rationality from intelligence or expertise. Can you tell us a bit more about what it actually means to reason well and why it's beneficial for us, and yet we struggle to reason even though it's in our best interest?
You know, given that you touch on this, this book, as you would sense, picks up on lots of experiences in the past. Intelligence and reasoning, the difference between this, I realized this from some really smart mathematical economists, absolutely first-rate minds. When you're at the blackboard talking about something abstract, chalk in hand, super brilliant. As soon as they are talking about real life, encountering a problem where the emotions come in, I would sense that they are floundering. They are very bad at it. The emotions get in the way of reasoning. And there is, you talked about experiments, one kind of experiment that I've done very, very informally is syllogisms, where you take something very abstract. If all men wear hats and Johnny is a man, Johnny wears a hat. True or false based on the first two statements. People tend to get it right. But bring in something emotional about human intelligence, something where the last line is obnoxious, but deduced from the first two sentences. So you're being asked purely, is that obnoxious sentence correct based on the first two sentences? People begin to trip up. They cannot face the fact that it's a sentence that does not sound right. And to me, yes, there are sentences which do not sound right, which you may have to not pronounce in public because it hurts, it wounds. There are sentences like that. But when you're reasoning, you have to, inside your head, you have to be ruthlessly hard with your reasoning. And a lot of the book's lesson is that inside your head, there has to be a certain ruthlessness. You have to encounter awful sentences and just see how you deal with them. You should be prepared to do that. And there is a liberating effect of going through that process. And since I do consider, I say this jokingly to my students, that, starting from my couple of difficult encounters very early in my life to now, I keep feeling life is every year is better than the previous year. And maybe this practice with reason makes, as you go through life every year, a bit better than the previous year.
So since we're talking about emotions right now and having to be ruthless with how we engage with our emotions as we try to think clearly through problems that may be obnoxious or very difficult or problematic, you write that feeling certain emotions don't actually lead us to undertake anything productive, but that those emotions may serve some utility. For example, they might signal some things to other people and help us navigate complex situations where coordination is necessary. Can you tell us a bit more about why you think such emotions exist, but how we can separate what is productive from what needs to be signaled?
Yeah, look, I can tell you that I'm no specialist in this. There are people who work on emotions where they come from, but my hunch is I do a little bit of evolutionary game theory very amateurishly, that a lot of our emotions have come from for evolutionary reasons. They make us very quickly, instinctively do the right things. The emotions help us with that. But there are contexts, and as you learn to manage your emotions more and more, where you would do better by taking the action that the emotion would prompt you to take, but not do it because of the emotion, but to do it for reasoning, by reason. And I'll give you one example. I do believe, I know this is people contest, that there are not good and bad people because of my own belief in determinism. In the end, it is our genetic start, the environments that I've been exposed to, that I've become what I have become. So I do believe, in a fundamental sense, human beings are not good or bad. They do dreadful things, and some do wonderful things, but they are not good or bad because of my belief in determinism. And that leads me to the position that when you think of punishment, it has to be an analytical prompting that makes you do that, rather than anger and vendetta. Just like when I talk about this in the book, if you see a tiger coming in your way, you don't get angry by saying that what a dreadful creature that bites and kills and maims. A tiger is a tiger. You may have to take real strong, tough steps, and there are situations where you may have to hurt the tiger to prevent greater hurt. But you don't waste time getting angry about the tiger. And it is not anger that prompts. Whereas in our human interactions, very often it is our anger that prompts certain behavior. Some of those behaviors are biologically conditioned through evolution, and that has allowed us to multiply and prosper. But if we can begin to park some of these worst emotions into the intellectual space of the brain, that I will treat that awful person as a tiger or a snake. I'm not going to have hatred or anger, but I will take steps to diffuse that person's actions. That's the best for yourself. Hopefully that also helps you take better actions, do better calculations.
Yeah, and you talk about the dinosaurs as well. I mean, just because something has served us in the past doesn't mean that it'll continue to serve us going forward. And humans are perhaps fortunate in the regard that we're able to reason and introspect and come up with better ways to adapt.
Yes, and I'm currently writing, I can't talk about it, it's a halfway through paper on the dinosaur risk that we human beings face. I've been working on this right now. Very incomplete project.
Well, we'll look forward to it. On this vein as well, in the book, you share a difficult and personal anecdote from your youth, where you were able to overcome a period of deep depression by reasoning with yourself. I think a lot of people will relate to that because they may be in a similar situation or may have navigated something like that in the past. Can you tell a bit more about that process and how you were able to reason your way out of that time?
Well, I'll just put a qualifier. Did I reason my way out of it, or did I just manage to get out of it and then used reason? I'm not completely sure. I got out of it, but I can tell you a little bit about that. This is in 1969. I joined college. So I grew up in Calcutta. So as before we started, we were discussing that is where your ancestors have a relationship to the city and to Bengal in general. I grew up in Calcutta, very sheltered household, very comfortable, sheltered with 4 elder sisters, parents, a happy home. Then at the age of 17, I moved to Delhi to a boarding college, which was with staying in residence. This was a bit of a jolt. And those days in India, there was this practice, this is a very British thing of ragging. You arrive in a new college and your seniors rag you, and some of that can be actually very, very difficult. So I was tense, excited and tense. My first 3 months went very well. St. Stephen's College, Delhi. It is a college with students from all over India with very different backgrounds we had collected in residence. Then I went home to Calcutta for a 15-day vacation, came back in October, and I can almost date it. So maybe the first 3 months was so much anxiety about the context, the ragging, etc., that nothing else happened. After that, it was a kind of depression. My book, I talk about it. It's 4 or 5 pages of the book. I talk about it because this is what happened. A kind of anxiety, depression. I look for words because I'm still not 100% sure what it was, began setting in. My friends, I had lots of friends in college, and we were usual standard youngsters with pranks and jokes and fun. No one would guess that I was going through this. I would get up, go to class, go back, restless nights, wake up deep inside me, a worry and anxiety. And another thing, which is a complete loss of interest in anything large. All the ambitions and things that you have in your youth all vanished. About 1.5 or 2 years of this. And now I talk about it lightly. But I remember when I had it, I would not talk to anyone. There are 2 things about that. India, those days, late 1960s, 70s, you didn't talk about a psychological problem. No one talked about it. I'm sure there were many in my class who were having similar. Later on, I discovered there was someone else who had very similar, who now lives in New York, had a very similar experience. But that was that. That lasted for about 1.5 years. And when I came out of it, 1.5, 2 years, when I came out of it, I was worried. The reason I would not talk about it to no one is that I was worried that it would trigger something in my brain. And I still don't know what it is. One of the reasons I wrote about this in my book is almost urging readers, and now it's an intellectual curiosity, as to what was it? Is it something biological that triggers this? Have others had it? It had a very clear daily cycle. I would wake up in the morning feeling fresh and good, and then slide into this, but all happening inside me because I was in class, I was with friends, joking, laughing, doing everything inside me. And then into the evening, it would be the same. And then somewhere late at night, again, I would get into some calmness and tranquility. And again, it would start next morning. I did have one consultation with a psychiatrist in Calcutta, only once. And that's the only time in my life I said, bless you. I did mention that I did not talk about this to anyone, but I did have one brief conversation with my mother, who may have talked to my father and suggested I meet one. I forget now, maybe Dr. Bhattacharya, doctor in Calcutta, psychiatrist, wonderful person. It didn't help me, but it was an hour of conversation. He seemed to be a very cerebral person, talking about philosophers, about psychiatrists, psychologists, the whole range, Carl Jung, his views about that, about Freud, and very comforting. And he said, I'll give you a couple of examples of people who have faced this, but I can't divulge my patients, but I can give you from some celebrities. And he picked out some celebrities from India and internationally and said, who have had similar experience. So I walked out feeling good about the conversation, but it didn't cure me. I got out of it after a year and a half, 2 years, though for a long time, for many years, I used to be scared about it, that it'll come back, and never talked to anyone. Reasoning, I feel, helped. Once I was getting out of it, I was beginning to reason. And another thing that did help me is when I discovered Hume, I discovered that he went through a very similar phase, and I felt a bit proud that I got into this psychological crisis 1 year before Hume. That gave me a sort of strange sense of comfort.
I do want to talk more about your intellectual journey as well, and determinism and Hume and how that's shaped your thinking. But I also want to pause and give the audience a chance to ask questions or share any comments. So please raise your hand if you would like to comment, or you can also drop a question in the chat. Anna?
Just wanted to welcome Dr. Basu on Intern Tag. This is such a joy. I remember reading Alison Gopnik's piece on Hume and how Hume had cured her midlife crisis. I'm quite fascinated by how, the Scottish Enlightenment, generally Enlightenment thinkers, democratic innovators of that era, Age of Reason, think that they invented the wheel. And then when you dig a little bit deeper, it turns out, oh, no, this was just a guy who had been to India or China and encountered Buddhism, encountered the I Ching, and then they came back to Europe and founded basically the Age of Reason on these concepts. Do you see something where we might still be a little bit too inactive in exploring how the East and West can learn from each other? Does Hume have a huge following in India, for instance? Do you see, because I'm asking this because it's such a cliche, and I wonder if you have, in your very unique journey, or in the process of your unique journey, encountered areas where we still haven't really abridged the two cultures.
Anna, thank you very much. Our paths had crossed without knowing in the Central Park once, so wonderful now to see you virtually. You mentioned Alison Gopnik. I have vague memories of that piece of hers, but she had it much later at the age of 50 or something like that, and talks beautifully about the use of David Hume and analog of that drew her into this. Yes, so I'm glad you mentioned Gopnik, because when I had read it, I had remembered that Hume has played a role in several people grappling with these kinds of problems. See, on Eastern and Western thought on this, I have to say I'm relatively ill-tutored on Eastern thought. It shouldn't have happened, excepting I grew up in a traditional household. So a lot of the wisdom that I was getting from my parents, from my huge joint family. I started out in a joint family with 8 fathers, 8 brothers living in little cubbyholes in a North Calcutta home. So a lot of it was sort of the philosophy of early Hindu writers, early Buddhist writers, which was a part of our household. They would talk about it. So I was growing up in that. The Western philosophy is a later discovery, and I've just read more on that. It was, as I just mentioned earlier, it was when I was finishing school. So around the age of 15, 16, that a friend of mine, one of those nerdy intellectuals in Calcutta, said that, you should read Bertrand Russell, Why I'm Not a Christian. And I read that, and then I went on to read the history of Western philosophy. Very deep influence on me. So that's my encounter with Western philosophy. But I have to say, on a personal note, my father did influence my thinking in a big way. Very traditional in many ways. I was born very late in his life, so he was pretty old, very traditional. I may be getting the day of the week wrong. Once a week, he would be going to the temple of Kali, the goddess. Once a week, at the end of a long, busy day's work, he would diligently go to the Kali temple. He would occasionally talk about religion, pretty standard stuff, so I would pick up little bits. But I also remember him getting into the car to go to the temple and muttering, "I don't really believe, but I don't want to take any chances." And he would head off to the temple. And this is Pascal's wager, which I later discovered. And it's too late now to be able to sit down and talk to my father on this. He was a lawyer. I do believe he was an extraordinarily intelligent person in a sort of philosophical way, worldly philosophy way. In fact, I feel his career in law was a bit of a waste of time. If he came into philosophy or something, he could have made contributions. But with my father, the little bits of conversation was, to me, again, the worldly philosopher, sort of perfect reasoning. I'll give you one more thing, which I don't know. It does go a little bit to some early writings in India, in early Hindu writings. You'll find these kinds of episodes in Mahabharata and Ramayana. But my father, I remember once when I was very small, I must have told a lie. And my mother was giving me a long lecture about how I must never tell a lie, that, that will displease God, and a lie is not worth it. Long lecture on the morality of not lying. When my father, and it's a bit of a Machiavellian lesson to give to a kid, was passing by to his legal chamber, he paused, listened to my mother giving me the lecture, and then he said that, I should tell you one thing: try in life to develop the trait where you hardly ever tell a lie, so that on the rare occasions when you do have to tell a lie, people believe you. It's a Machiavellian piece of a lesson. Why should you tell a lie? Should you tell it for a personal reason? I do take a view on balance. I'm a consequentialist. I believe that we should take steps for a better world. I have later on, through the writings of Parfit and others, come to believe that deontological ethics also play a role, though in a consequentialist way. In the long run, you want to build a better world. So to me, on truth and lies, and this does fit in, I know, with a lot of Oriental philosophy, is that the occasional lie, but for an ethical reason, where that lie would create a better world, may be justified. There are problems with that. It's a deep, intricate problem. Parfit has examples of, if you use this logic too many times, speech will begin to erode and lose its power. It's a complicated topic for a casual conversation like this. But so my Oriental philosophy comes from my relatives living in Calcutta, living in Delhi, growing up there. It is a part of me. But the Western philosophy is something that I've read. And after I stumbled onto David Hume, I felt that that is my philosophy. I mean, it's very close to him. And not that that is my philosophy because Hume said it, but because I find that a lot of my thinking is very, very similar. And yes, there are a few lessons that I've taken from his writings that
I think I spend a lot of time these days thinking about truthfulness. I recently turned 40 and I made this vow for myself that I would always speak the truth, not just when asked, but in a kind of proactive way, in a life-shaping way, that you can't say that you believe, which I do believe, that ideas shape the world, that the matter is moved by information without ensuring that that information is correct. And to me, it's a kind of fascination that by correctly describing the factual level of reality, you actually change it. And that's how that the truth can kind of conquer determinism. You write a lot about determinism in your thinking. And as you were talking, I'm thinking, actually, the Abrahamic religions have a very similar take on lying as your late father did. Because, I mean, Jesus has a whole spiel about, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. So it's not a lie to pay taxes. It's just like kind of utilitarian thinking. Like you want to stay alive, at least a little bit. unless, otherwise challenged. The Talmud also has one of the parables is basically like, should you always tell the truth? And then the rabbi is like, yes, but you're not going to go up to a person that you find ugly and tell them they're ugly. That's not how, that's not truthfulness. That's just being a jerk, right? In Buddhism, you have the right speech, which comes up a lot at Interact events. So to me, that there is something, and Parfit tried to kind of reconcile consequentialism and all the other big schools. So I really commend you for those points. I think that's more realistic and helpful in the Aristotelian sense for people to just navigate real life.
Again, my reading of my own Oriental philosophy is not adequate, but you have episodes in the Mahabharata where Yudhishthira, the person of impeccable moral character, feels that this is an occasion where you have to tell a lie. And it is a lie again for a better world, because it is almost like someone with a dagger rushing up to you and asking you, where did that man go, left or right? And you pause for a moment and think whether you're going to tell the truth or tell a lie for the consequentialist reason you don't want that person to die. There are these moments in Mahabharata which are just magical little moments. Yeah.
I mean, in Zen koans, you have stories like the disciple asks the Zen master, "What do I do, master, when I face a great army?" And the Zen master says, "Run." Just get out of there. It's not a spiritual question. Just get out of there.
Yeah.
Since we've stumbled onto the topic of philosophy and determinism, I'd love to hear you tell us a bit more about how you stumbled onto this way of thinking as a student and how it's shaped your understanding of what it means to live a moral and responsible life and navigate the world.
Yeah. Yeah, and I do believe that the moral and responsible life is extremely important. You strive for that. There are moral quandaries and dilemmas you get into, but wanting to live that life. How did I get into this? I can tell you about my getting into determinism, which was through just pure logic with one axiom. I do believe that the world is causally determined. That is an axiom. I can't prove that. I do assume that that's an assumption I instinctively feel is right, that the world is causally determined. If the world is causally determined, then at a point of time t, two individuals, if they have exactly identical histories, identical environment, everything, the choice that one person will make at this point of time, the other person will make the same choice at that point of time, because it's cause that leads to your choice. So that led me to a very, very early problem in life about free will. Do we human beings have free will, or is it all predetermined? This was in my college days in St. Stephen's College in Delhi. I would have arguments with friends, and I reached the conclusion where I have changed my mind, that I believe that we don't have a free will was my earlier belief. That we are determined, fully determined creatures without free will. I now believe, to cut to the last line, I do believe we are fully determined creatures, but I also believe that we have free will. By the way, I should give you one digressive note over here. Amartya Sen, the economics Nobel Prize winner. I know Amartya's works backwards. He was my PhD advisor. One of his earliest pieces is about determinism and free will, which he wrote as a student, published, it's hardly ever cited, and where he takes a position very similar to the position that I take, but he later on told me he's changed his mind. This was many years ago. He told me he's changed his mind, and I've also changed my mind, so I don't know whether I'm at the same place, but let me just explain. I believe that we are fully determined, but that does not mean we don't have a choice. We very often have a choice. Should I be a lawyer or should I be an economist is a choice I face. And it is a choice I'm taking pretty freely. It's a free choice, but what I will choose is also predetermined. So I do have a choice, but what I will choose is predetermined. And I feel David Hume's position, I have never been able to be certain about this, is very similar. Hume is a determinist. Does he believe that we also have, at the same time, have free choice? I don't quite know. But this leads to a whole lot of issues about morality. I do have moral responsibility because I can't just say that, look, I was predetermined. I am making a choice, and that's my responsibility. What I will choose, if someone knew everything about me, my history, my past, my genetic makeup, that person would be able to sit in that adjacent room and predict what I'm going to do correctly, including my choice. But the fact that someone else can predict my choice does not mean that I don't have a choice. I had a choice, but someone else could predict. Chrysippus of Soli, going back to the Greeks, seem to have a similar view about determinism, but you're speculating from bits and pieces of readings.
Why is it so important for us to be able to make that distinction, that even if our choices are predetermined, that we still do have a choice? And how does that affect how we should think about how people make certain decisions or whether they are morally responsible for them?
Yeah, two things over here. That decision is important, first of all, not to lose the responsibility of your own decisions. You are taking your decisions, so you have a moral responsibility. And there's no logical inconsistencies in saying that we live in a determined world, but I make my choices. But it does influence your assessment of other human beings. When you're assessing another human being who has already made a choice, to know that that was a choice that that person had to make. It's true that person went through a cogitation, but the cogitation itself is predetermined, changes your attitude to the other human being. And this, I keep saying, with other human beings, it's like tigers and snakes, awful human beings. You have to take the attitude that we take towards tigers and snakes. You don't hate them, but you know that you have to handle these people. So it does influence the way you, and I think, a lot of my, the fact that anger management comes from this realization that other human beings are determined creatures. They make choices, but the choices they make are themselves determined. That does give you a certain attitude to life. And David Hume, I'm sorry, I keep coming back to that, talking about one of his reasons for his equanimity, or ataraxia, as the Greeks would say, I feel stemmed from this philosophy. The beautiful line that he said at the time that he was dying, he knew he was dying. He says, I'm dying as fast as my enemies, comma, if I had any. It's an approximate quote because Hume thought that he generally got along with people so well that maybe he didn't have any enemies. I'm dying as fast as my enemies, if I had any, could wish, and as easily and cheerfully as my best friends could desire. That sort of sums up his attitude to life. It's hard to get to that, but you strive for that, and you do believe that there are also thinkers, philosophers. I'm thinking of Gandhi in India, who may have reached very, very similar positions. Swami Vivekananda, who once upon a time walked in the streets of New York. I feel fascinated by Vivekananda's life in New York. It's very difficult to decipher and understand him. He lived with a Jewish thinker, Leon Landsberg, on 33rd Street, very close to where I live now, in 1894. If you read him and try to understand, the language is different. It was a long time ago. It's a very, very similar philosophical position, which leads to a certain amount of calm, which was there in his philosophy and in his writings.
Oh, Anna, you also had a question or comment?
Thank you so much. Yeah, I had a comment on the free will and kind of the choose your own adventure question. I don't think that choices are predetermined. I think that's where I, as a human being, experience the paradox of truthfulness and determinism. Because what fascinates me about this is that I think people are so wary, so scared of choices because they understand causal determinism. So you know that if you choose to move there, marry him, quit, sign that contract, etc., you kind of kickstart a chain reaction, and we understand how these chain reactions work. And I wonder whether you, since writing the book, have come across interesting new ideas about free will. I know we discuss a lot Sapolsky's notions in Interintellect, which is more coming from the biological determinism angle. What are some ideas about free will, Dr. Basu, that you might disagree with, but that you find interesting?
Anna, and please do call me Kaushik. Can I jump to using inductive logic, which is there in my book? I talk about a causal chain using which is a strategy that authoritarian leaders use. Whether deliberately or unwittingly, the successful ones use it. And I got thinking about it, looking around at the world. This is Lukashenko. I thought that his regime is going to fall, I thought once upon a time, because my hunch was that 90% of the population wanted him to go, 95% of the population wanted him to go, but he did not fall. And there are other regimes. Ben Ali, I used to watch Tunisia very closely once upon a time. I thought he would continue to stay, but his regime collapsed and he fled from the country. Here, I use inductive logic to understand the kind of strategy that someone like Lukashenko may have used. And this has a root in philosophy, 1949, writing in mind on the surprise test paradox. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but you don't have to be. I can tell you what the logic is. Suppose that Lukashenko, take a very simple example. My book discusses it. I call it the incarceration paradox or the incarceration story. And this is the following. And I do believe that dictators and tyrants use this. Suppose you expect that your country, and for simplicity, assume that there are 1,000 people in your country. The population is 1,000. All 1,000 are going to come out into the streets of Minsk and protest. And if all 1,000 come out, you are finished. You are out of power. And you can, let us say, arrest at most 100. And if you can arrest at most 100, if 1,000 comes out, you're finished. So, and let us suppose that citizens are so angry with your regime that they have the following thing, that if I'm got some chance that I won't be arrested, I will go out and protest. But if it is 100% that I will be arrested, then I won't go. Quite a rational thing. If I'm 100% going out into the streets, I'll be picked up and incarcerated. I won't do it. Keep these in mind. 1,000 people all want to protest. Lukashenko has the ability to arrest only 100. It seems that he's gone. The people are going to come out into the streets. And if 900 people are protesting, you fall. But here is something Lukashenko can do using the kind of logic that you are hinting at, but it's formally constructed. Lukashenko breaks up the society into the 1,000 people into, let us say, 10 groups of 100 each, 100 journalists, 100 of the opposition leaders. So group 1, group 2, up to group 10. And then Lukashenko makes an announcement. When people come out into the streets, I will arrest not randomly, but all those who are in group 1. Let us say journalists. I will first pick up all the ones among the journalists. If there aren't enough journalists in the streets protesting against me, I will turn to group 2. Pick up the group 2 people and arrest them. If there aren't enough of the group 2 people, I'll go to group 3, etc. This is a logic which has a history in game theory. Bob Aumann writing about knowledge, and in philosophy even earlier, 1949, with the surprise test paradox. Now see, with this announcement of Lukashenko's, if this becomes common knowledge, everyone knows this is the way he's going to arrest, this is how people will reason.
Yeah.
The journalists are not going to go out because they know they'll be arrested for sure, because he has said he's going to pick up the journalists first, so none of the journalists will go. Knowing that the group 1 people are not going to go out into the streets, group 2 people will conclude that it's not worthwhile for us to go into the streets. We'll be arrested for sure because none of the group 1 will be there. So we'll be arrested. So group 2 won't go. Group 3 people, knowing that group 1 and group 2 won't go, will know that if I go, I'll be in the front line, I'll be arrested. So no one goes. This is the incarceration game. And I believe that in wittingly or unwittingly, authoritarian leaders use this strategy to diffuse the protest. Even when everyone is against you, you can stall that.
This is my favorite. Common knowledge is my favorite part of game theory. And we often discuss, Scott Aronson had a piece on Aumann and the Tyler Coe and Robin Hanson paper about, and he uses it to describe why communism hadn't fallen earlier. And of course, like having been born in a communist country, I'm always so surprised because other than Romania, nobody really did a communism ending revolution. And then they kind of go through how there is no common knowledge. Everybody knows, but nobody knows who else knows. And that's enough to kind of create this very modular, disconnected society. And then I would be interested to hear whether you think current American society has something similar going on with the social media of silos, and nobody really can know what the world model of the other group is, or whether the other group even exists, right? It's even kind of conspiracy theorized which groups even exist and how many people are there. Are there Americans? Are there bots? Are there just a couple of people with multiple anonymous accounts? It's becoming impossible.
Yeah. Anna, first of all, the second last chapter of my book, I fleetingly touch on group dynamics. It is not as big a question that you're raising, but the question that you're raising is of current interest to me because I'm working on a manuscript which is tentatively titled "The Grammar of Authoritarianism." That it is really trying to understand the logical structure of authoritarian regimes. I've given some lectures and I'm writing this up. But in my book that we are discussing, in the penultimate chapter, I talk of group morality, the behavior of a group of people, which can be so very different from what each individual intends to do. So it is trying to understand this. And this, once again, I have to say that I fall back on my philosophy. When a group behaves dreadfully, I try to always hold back and say that you don't begin to blame each and every element of this group, because the group dynamics are so complex that each well-intentioned human being can create a group which is ill-intentioned. This intention between the group's behavior and the intention of the individual could be very different. We know this from one standard game, the prisoner's dilemma. But even in the moral domain, we have this. And I have a section called Greta's dilemma. Greta being, there's only one Greta that one talks about, Greta Thunberg, is that Greta Thunberg's impatience about climate and that we are not doing anything about it is correct. But a lot of it could be that each one of us, like Greta herself, is very, very keen to do something. But the dynamic is such that as a group, we behave obnoxiously. And here, to me, is an intellectual agenda, big one, to take the real world, the complicated real world, and try to understand that it is the bees. We are like bees, each one with a little intention. Of course, that is the project of economics from the time of Adam Smith. But in our political economy world, we want to get into this. And I'm nowhere near an answer. And who knows, maybe the dinosaur risk will hit us before we get the answer.
Can I just, if it's useful for your book, the great Hungarian writer of the early 20th century, Frigyes Karinti, who famously, I think he's most famous for a quote from his marriage. They married as a second marriage. He married the love of his life. And at some point he's writing at his desk and calls out to his wife and says, "Sweetheart, I think my child and your child are beating up our child." And it has ever since become the kind of famille composée motto in my where I'm from. He has a short story called Barabbas about how the crowd in the New Testament has to choose between Jesus and Barabbas who should die. And Pilate kind of gives the choice to the crowd. And there is a character, kind of an apostle going around the crowd, and everybody agrees that they will say Jesus. Of course, that Jesus has to live. And then Pilate at the end of the short story asks the crowd who should be freed, and the crowd says Barabbas. And they are surprised that they as a crowd say Barabbas, because individually they all wanted to say Jesus. And I so often think about this when it comes to the almost fluid dynamics nature of crowds and group dynamics.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I found the thought experiments like Greta's dilemma very illuminating and helping understand how you can end up with adverse outcomes collectively, even if individuals, one or many, behave morally. Now, given that, what do you think we can do to try to break out of this situation? I think you touch on some proposals in the final chapter, such as conventions and ways to mitigate inequality, which are ambitious and large. What are some ways that we can begin?
Alaka, I may back up on this a little bit with these dynamics. We have little bits of understanding from early writing, and this is Hungary's neighboring country, Václav Havel. His writings, big influence for me also. I discovered Havel's writing when it had been smuggled out of the country and was being translated into English. And Stephen Lukes, the philosopher, was helping its translation. He gave me a typed manuscript. So I was very proud of this, that it's called The Power of the Powerless. And Alka, you probably can sense immediately, the title itself is hinting at that. Each individual is powerless, but collectively there is a power, and that's what Havel is talking about. And Havel is touching on something very, very similar, that a group of people can behave obnoxiously. And in many ways, Havel's description of this is very generous, because he says even the person at the top could be completely in a trap where the person can't get out of the situation that you've got into. So the whole group is in a trap. How do you break out of it? That is the question, that to prevent that, you're asking that to have a better world, how do you do it? There is no easy answer. And the current work that I'm doing, which I touch on in the last chapter on conventions and agreements, is to do with that. One, of course, way to break out of it is a couple of irrational people. Who was it who said this? Was it Bernard Shaw? I'm forgetting now. That the rational people know that the world can't be changed, but the world changes because of irrational people. And at one level, you can see that Czechoslovakia changed because of someone like Havel, who, after having described human rationality, that no one should do something, he stuck his neck out and was prepared to do something. In India, the colonial period, Gandhi, he is in many ways irrational, because his calculation for Gandhi's self is very different from our calculation for ourselves. So he acts in an irrational way in and out of jail, and he liberates, in many ways, liberates the country. Liberation is a strong word. It's an endless process, of course. So first of all is a couple of irrational people. And irrational in this case could be just moral commitment so deep that you're willing to take on Nelson Mandela sitting in jail for 28, 29 years. Of course, sitting in jail, he had no choice. Once he's in there, he's there. But he chose that he would rather go in jail than give in to this. So life is full of those. Where I'm currently working on, and the last chapter that you refer to, I talk about, is at one level, what you need is an advance agreement among us human beings that certain dreadful things that we do, we will not do. And here I again put on the game theorist's hat. You know, I have to bring in one technical name, John Nash. Very, very celebrated name, of course, John Nash, if for nothing else, because he's such a kind of colorful character that there was a film made on him. I remember I'm digressing, in Bombay, Mumbai, there was this huge, Nash came to speak and a huge crowd gathered. And I think they had come to see the film on John Nash, and they were very disappointed by Nash's talk at that time. Now, Nash gave us an equilibrium concept, which is to do with individuals. But there are counterparts of this equilibrium concept to a group and a collectivity, that if you get into a prior agreement that all of you will live by these basic rules, then it becomes in your self-interest. If everyone else is doing that, it becomes in your self-interest to live by those rules. Not easy at all, but at one level, the abstract idea of a constitution is pretty much, that is what you're looking at. There is one philosopher, van der Graaf, who in the United States now has worked on constitutions and agreements, which are a collective agreement. But once you've got into this, it's in your interest to abide by that. And at one level, our aspiration now is to create one of these agreements. And it sounds idealistic. How can you do that? The whole world getting into a common agreement. But pause for a moment and think of the US Constitution. Think of the Indian Constitution. Massive countries where when you first talk in terms of some ground rules for everyone, it seems like impossible. But the United States did it. India did it. There is a constitution. It's violated often. It gets challenged. There are dangers, but there is a constitution. I feel for the world, yes, there are things like the UN Charter, but we live in such a small world that we do need to think in terms of a global constitution much more proactively than we've done before. And also, I do talk about this in the last chapter. You know, nationalism, the national identity, once upon a time, it was racial identity, religious identities. These have played a role through history. But we are in a small enough world, and this does go in with a feeling that I have, which is an instinctive feeling, an emotional feeling, that our common human identity is so much more important than the narrow group identities, that really we have to try to begin to think in terms of our first and foremost identity is the human identity. And there are philosophers and writers, and I mentioned Oriental writing, and I can not far back into history, but I can give recent writings. Tagore, the poet, Rabindranath Tagore. His writings about the human identity, and he writes this in the middle. He created a lot of controversy when India was fighting for independence. He kept reminding us that, yes, at this point of time, we have to fight for independence. The national identity is important, but we must never give up on the thought that we human beings have a larger human identity. And ultimately, it is that identity that has to rule the world. And as the world becomes narrower with globalization, with linkages, we have to get back to the drafting board of constitution with the world in mind, the way it was done in the United States once upon a time for the country, in India once upon a time for the country. We have to think in terms of this for the world. Hard project. I know it is idealistic project, and not for a moment am I foolish enough to think that we'll get there. The dinosaur did perish, and we might perish because we failed to do that. But I like to believe, I like to clutch on to that hope that we will have the wisdom to go towards that. And my last chapter is a bit of a chapter in the air, because I have a couple of concrete proposals about inequality, which I feel very strongly, and I can talk about it if you want, but there's also a bit of this hand-waving appeal to us as human beings that our large human identity should be the predominant identity.
Since you mentioned the US and Indian constitutions, I am curious, what do you think makes them successful, and in comparison to constitutions that other countries have had but perhaps failed to implement?
Very, very difficult to know. And there are, when troubled times come, and India, US, all these countries are going through very troubled times, you do worry that this thing that we take as strong, will it survive? Will it pull through, or will it begin to give in? After all, there are ways in which you can bring a constitution down, and the world is littered with examples of countries that began rock solid, and even advanced economies, you get shocked how it begins to collapse. So no hard rule really. And when I look back at India, I do feel good that maybe there was something in the early founding of the country, that this larger identity, you know, even Nehru as the first prime minister, I love this little letter he wrote to the chief ministers in the state, saying that the national identity is extremely important. And at this stage of history, we have to live by that for the nation. But, and you know, coming from a prime minister, there's something quite marvelous. But at the same time, we must remember that we are a part of the world, part of the universe. So there is a larger identity. And he said that he would like to believe that there will come a time when that will be the primary identity. So you strive towards that. But I don't have anything concrete to offer over there. And this is a bit of a research agenda of mine that, who knows, you may stumble upon. I'm getting into something technical. I'm mentioning again, Nash's equilibrium is an equilibrium about each individual taking a decision. I have worked with a couple of other people, and there's a lot of work about groups of actions which become self-enforcing through a very tightly knit game theoretic argument. These equilibrium where it's a whole set of actions you're allowed to take, but not something else, and then it becomes a part of your self-interest, are there. And maybe we can construct something out of that, but just a maybe at this point of time.
Mm-hmm. Anna, you had a comment or question?
I'm very back in the day when I was a screenwriter, one of the films that I wrote was about the Chernobyl disaster and how the Hungarian media had failed to report on it. Actually, only one person that I know, who is the father of a childhood friend of mine, who kind of in code, to kind of go back to the common knowledge question, reported it on live TV. It goes back to your beautiful modeling of the 1,000 divided into 1,000. What would have been a journalist's motivation to report on it? It would have been redacted immediately and you would have been fired. Right. So it's not like, when you watch and Masha Green has a beautiful piece on how Americans don't understand dictatorships, and an English person can never make a movie about the death of Stalin or Chernobyl, sadly, or The Handmaid's Tale, because that's not how it works. How dictatorships work is that they mess with your inner sense of reality, the good and bad, the public and the private, what is truth? Is it a moral thing to live within your family in a moral way? But then you have to go outside in the world in a Havelian sense and lie, and then you go back home and feed your son with the money that you made with lying. What does that make of that relationship? And I'm always really fascinated by how social contracts break down. My theory personally is that the Cold War ended with Chernobyl. The social contract in the East Bloc, where I'm from, was that you put up with the lies, you put up with the charades that no thinking person would think that they believe in, although you don't know who else is the thinking person. But in exchange, you are taken care of. And the Chernobyl disaster happened on the 26th of April in 1986. And then on the 30th of April, so the cloud went up and it went to Sweden and the northern east coast of the United States of America. And then in a couple of days, it came back to Eastern Europe. And on the 30th of April, 4 days later, it rained down in the form of nuclear rain. But nevertheless, the next day, the 1st of May, the authorities across the entirety of the East Bloc had sent the population out in the millions to march. And there was this moment, and I have goosebumps just talking about it. There was this moment that my parents, grandparents generation would talk about, when you see the wet streets and because people had phones and talked to each other, and you are sent out. And that's the moment when that social contract was over. And I keep thinking how, in America, I just moved here literally 5 days ago. And I keep thinking that here you have the other social contract, which is that you're not being taken care of, but you are given tools to take care of yourself, right? You are allowed to succeed in ways that, yes, the European system and mentality do not allow. Like, we can, decorate the European mindset however we want, but it's true that you have in the East Bloc, you have the fear, in the North, you have the tall poppy syndrome. It's not anymore built for the unreasonable man. I think America is built for the unreasonable man. And so I keep thinking, like, okay, that's fine. Obviously, long-lasting human relationships and social relationships go through a variety of renegotiations of the social contract, but for that, you need the truth. Right? The Havelian system is so diabolical because it robs you from the opportunity of knowing what the fact is, so that you can even sit down and have a conversation. If you look at the great constitutions of the world that actually still work, they were truthful of their time. Actually, one of the problems with the Constitution of the US is, like, it was true then, but it's not necessarily true now in our concept. And I'm really curious whether, when you think about group dynamics, what is truth different at the scale of the group? Is it still the human truth? and what can an individual do to help aid the kind of social healing?
Anna, do you call yourself Anna or Anna?
Anna.
Anna, yeah. So see, I may have a disagreement with you. So let me try to articulate. I want to see if it's a disagreement or not. I feel that these traps that gets built, and then you begin to live in an almost a fictitious world. I mean, it's being created around you. That when they go, I feel as yet we have virtually no understanding of how they collapse. So to me, it is, and I'll give you the example which after I had first encountered Havel's work and read about the activism over there of a small group, but this frightening, horrendous trap that you're living inside. And now also I have an obsessive interest in North Korea because it is a country which is a model of this. And I've been, by the way, I mean, in my career in the policy world, I used to tell my bosses, if you ever want to send someone to North Korea, I want to go because I want to see for myself what's happening. I'm curious.
Don't go. What if you can't come back?
I think my good sense will prevail when the time comes. I won't go. But I have that. But let me step back. When I first read Havel's description, I thought that, this kind of a thing can't happen in some societies where there's much more honesty, truth. But then the McCarthy period in the United States was a sobering almost 4 years for me. And I got interested in it because the structure of the control that was beginning to emerge was so very similar to Havel's description of what was happening in this what Havel never names the country. It's a post-totalitarian state he talks about. But what was happening during the McCarthy period is very similar. And also Arthur Miller describing witchcraft and people being described as witches, the whole town of Salem coming out of that are very similar processes. But let me pause with the McCarthy period. People are being charged that you're un-American, you're a communist sympathizer, whatever it is. There are a couple of things you're not allowed to charge. When the charge comes, the reason why this becomes so powerful, this charge, is someone who knows the person. If I run up and say that, no, I know this person, it's completely wrong. People are already programmed to think that someone who stands up and says that the charge against that person is wrong is also a part of that group. And Havel's reasoning, if you read The Power of the Powerless carefully, and I've just read it many, many times, it's exactly that each individual is like another individual in another society leading a very, very free life, but collectively they are in this. So I feel there is almost coming from nowhere a trap that you get into. How do you break out of it? It can be one big disaster. I mean, North Korea, if it does break out of this shell, will be in our lifetime. We are seeing something that comes out of it. We've seen this happen very often. Of course, if there is a big disaster, that can trigger off changes, that can make people desperate. And occasionally also a few determined, irrational people can begin to rupture this. And then it goes. There's one account, I'm thinking, Haile Selassie's fall of the regime of Haile Selassie. There's a beautiful description that when you go and see Ethiopia in those days, it's a regime of perfect loyalty. Everyone is loyal to Haile Selassie. Then within months of the fall of Selassie, it's gone. Where were those people who were loyal? But it's a mimicking of a created world. So I'm not quite sure anymore whether it's a disagreement or I'm putting it in different words, but there is, to me, there is something almost trivial about these dome-like powerful structures, but the constituent of that can be something trivial, but it creates these structures which are very, very rock solid. And we don't quite still understand how they fall. We would want many of these to fall.
So as we're talking about the final chapter in the book and your vision for a more equitable world, you do mention that we're at a turning point in history and that something is different about this time, like authoritarianism is on the rise again. There's an increase in inequality. That's something that you've worked on extensively and feel very strongly about. Can you tell us a bit more about what are some of the things we need to implement both nationally and globally, and how people who might be distant from some of these big abstract problems can begin to engage with them in a more thoughtful and proactive manner?
Alaka, there's it's a short discussion which is there in the book. Inequality, economic inequality. I do believe that the level of inequality that we have in the world today, if we manage to overcome it, there will come a time when, looking back at our generation, the future, our progenies will be shocked that we sat back and tolerated this level of inequality. And I feel the shock will be the same way that we get shocked about things in history. Dreadful practices of caste, one group being discriminated, worst forms of feudalism, slavery in America. The inequality today, some people's not sure whether they will get tomorrow's food or not. And some people fabulously rich will, to retrospective generations, if they do manage to break out of this, they will be shocked by this. What do you do? And why is this a problem? As an economist, and in many ways my work is mainstream economics, I do believe that a certain amount of inequality, in fact, a fair amount of inequality will have to be there in life, economic inequality. That creates incentives, you work harder to get there, etc. But there are two things about the inequality in today's world. The level of inequality, the richest people, this is causing a problem that we are not paying enough attention to, and especially in the world of influencers with the social media. The power of the super rich can become so large that you begin to damage democracy. People begin to keep quiet, and there are anthropological studies and small studies in rural India that in a village council where people are sitting and talking, the poor and the middle classes talking, when the super rich landlord comes in, the poorest people go completely quiet. They lose their voice. And I feel we are at a dangerous point where really the super rich can begin to damage democracy in the world by their power. And in the world of social media, the power of influence is so big that we have to think about it before we destroy democracy, to the point where we don't even have the power to think and cogitate about whether this needs a correction. So the level of inequality, I do believe, needs correction. The other form of inequality which does trouble me is, again, from personal experience, but you have to look around, inequality at birth. Mainstream economics, neoclassical economics will keep saying that, look, if you work hard, you do better. To a certain extent, that is true. And to a certain extent, that is choice. There are some people who wouldn't care about making a lot of money because they are having great fun in what they are doing. That's fine. But a lot of inequality is inequality at birth. Some people who are born absolutely with nothing, some people who are born so wealthy that they wouldn't quite know how to go below a floor, below which it's difficult for them to go. This has very little justification. And, at a personal level, when I used to go back home to Calcutta, visiting my mother, who used to live alone in Kolkata in a moderately well-off area, not very well-off, but moderately well-off area, I would every morning, going back from America, spend early in the morning, I would go for a walk to a neighboring area, which is very, very wealthy area in Kolkata. And there I would walk around, and the thought would every now and then strike me that to say that if you work hard, you can make it. People who are being born in slums with absolutely nothing, the chance of their making, one might make it through fluke, chance is negligible. The inequality at birth cannot be justified by saying that, look, these people were working hard. Well, they've just been born. So the question of their having worked hard does not arise. So that inequality at birth ought to be corrected a fair amount. And this is a certain amount of inheritance tax, that a percentage be taken away at that time, which does not get transferred into super rich babies. The super rich babies become a bit less rich, and the super poor babies become a bit poorer because there is this transfer mechanism. And since you were pushing me into details, this is an intricate topic. And as an economist, I'm very engaged. Within a single country, This is a policy very difficult to follow. And we've seen follies of this kind in former communist countries, where you go and you think you are going to bulldoze in and bring in a lot of inequality. You end up creating the worst form of crony capitalism. Some of these communist countries ended up in the worst forms of crony capitalism because it was not a thought through system. And inequality in the world today, to a certain extent, you can tackle it within the country and you must give attention to that. But a lot of it is also international. Because if you go too harsh within your country, you will have the capital flying out of the country, parking themselves elsewhere. One very practical domain where I've seen a problem where China comes into play is the use of forced labor, for instance, prison labor. China used to provide that. And a lot of capital would go there. You get very, very cheap labor because it is prison labor being used. There, one country begins to play against another country. Another country that tries to improve the conditions of their labor will know that capital will quit my country and go into another country where labor has no rights and park their international capital over there. So there is, once again, this is a domain where there is a lot of policy-making question across countries, where it moves away from the book to what I've spent my full life on, which is economic policy making and its details. And of course, as an economist, I'm very interested in that, and I occasionally write about that. And there are prominent people who are working, from Thomas Piketty to a whole lot of people who are working and writing on this problem.
Yeah, I found that part of the book especially interesting because I enjoy economics. I mean, what you mentioned about capital flight, you do mention that it is a potential consequence of something that you propose as mitigating perhaps inequality, the accordion tax. Can you tell us briefly about like why the accordion tax might work, how it preserves incentives to keep producing and be productive, but is also different from what is currently in place?
Yeah. I can tell you that accordion tax comes from a little bit of going outside of economics to behavioral economics and psychology, which is, of course, new, but there's also historically people have written about it, that once you are above a certain income level, your primary motivation for more is the relative income. I mean, beyond the point, once you've got 2 yachts, I don't even know why you need 2 yachts. Once you've got 2 yachts, the need for the third yacht is very difficult to think of. Accepting that if your neighbor has 2 yachts, just the display of the third yacht has a role. And even, Malinowski talking about Trobriand Islands, which is reasonably poor, there they said, after you've got enough food to eat, people would put their food on display so that others can see you've got enough food. Beyond a point, you can't eat. But in the Trobriand Island, the wealthy, relatively wealthy, would put the food on the sills where others would be able to see that you've got food. So, and I feel that, and there's enough reason to believe that beyond a certain income, the striving and the motivation is the Jones next door whom you want to beat. That being so, the worry that economists have that as soon as you begin to tax at the top end, you will kill their incentive is not true if you can do the taxation in a way that above a certain income, because up to a lot of time you are trying to do better. And once you take the whole range of human aspirations, better health, whole lot of things, you need a fair amount of money. But beyond that, it's just the relative competition. There, from that point, it's a slightly technical thing discussed in my book. If you go past that and begin to tax people like an accordion, same percentage, let us say, but the super rich is paying 90% above the cutoff. So 90% not of your total income, but above that cutoff, the remainder, you're taking 90% and transferring it to the poorest people whose incomes are improving. So it's like an accordion, it opens up. That is the accordion tax. And my argument is that if you do that for the very rich, you're not going to affect their incentive. As long as you know that you're richer than the person next door, the super rich, and you will continue to strive because you want to keep that rank. So you're not going to damage incentives in the world, but you will hopefully take an important precaution against democracy being damaged, because super rich people have so much voice that you're damaging democracy. The very poor people will begin to do better. So that is the accordion tax. I put it into the book a bit self-consciously because that goes into the kind of economics I do, which my book is not about, but I thought I'm talking about global welfare in the last chapter. So there's that very brief discussion of the accordion tax. And that was the nutshell of it.
Yeah, I mean, I found the examples in the last chapter thought-provoking in that it encouraged us to like go from there and learn more and see how these things might play out in the real world.
Yeah. Can I jump and give an example
Yes.
from a very different domain? But if someone's asking something about the book, I'll take it. But otherwise, very different domain of this kind of economic reasoning.
Yes, and then we'll invite questions.
Okay, just give me then 2 minutes, which had got me into trouble and then created a big research agenda on child labor. You know, in 1994, immediately after I came to the United States, I published an op-ed in New York Times. I was very lucky. I mean, I just sent it anonymously and New York Times took it on child labor, the problem of child labor. And there I was putting on my economist's hat and arguing that, look, child labor is dreadful. You do want to do away with it. But very often people who are policymakers take decisions that you ban it from tomorrow, make it with a mistaken assumption. And that assumption was there in Senator Harkins's bill. In the preamble, it says that child labor happens because of greedy entrepreneurs looking for the cheapest forms of labor and slothful parents sending out their children out to work. I had just moved to America from India. And I said, you know, entrepreneurs' greed, I understand. But it's not slothful parents who send their children out to work. It is an act of absolute desperation that you do that. Once you are aware of that, child labor policy cannot be a mechanical one that you ban it tomorrow. You have to go in through the fiber work of society. You have to understand how you intervene, how you get into that. And that had become a big topic that I worked on for many years on how do you design the law and the intervention. And my last chapter is a little bit in that spirit in a different domain. But let me shut up on that.
Thank you. I'll invite questions. Dawn, I think you raised your hand. You're welcome to share.
Thank you. I wanted to ask, the idea of the accordion tax, you know, I certainly understand the principle, but it does seem like it would have to be on some kind of international level, because what would happen nationally is that they would just, you know, the very rich are going to put their income in some other place where you don't have the accordion tax. So that was sort of, you know, I can see it. I mean, as humans, if we're trying to get an international coordination of raising the level of everybody on the planet, that seems like a good idea. It's just getting all that international cooperation seems like it would be difficult. And one specific question I wanted to ask is, have you seen in the history of any of the nations that you studied, or any particular nation who has been successful in reducing inequality in some way?
Well, let me first take your first question about the global dimension. You're absolutely right. And in my book, I don't know whether I finally put in or not. I did want to put in a couple of lines. I think it's there, that within a nation, your hands are tied quite a bit because of exactly the reason that you point out, that if you begin to bring in the accordion tax with any severity, you're going to park your money in another country and use it. So in my book, I very briefly touch on, but I have talked elsewhere, that a lot of the problem of inequality today is, again, among the many problems which are increasingly coming to the global agenda of all countries. It is beginning to arrive over there. So some amount of inequality management has to be a globally designed policy, just like we have WTO, World Trade Organization, on trade with global rules. ILO beginning to bring in some labor rules across the world. I do believe that we need a fiscal policy coordination on taxation and things much more than what we've done. It won't be easy, but it's not impossible. So that part is correct. You're talking about whether we've seen examples of greater and less equal interventions. You know, greater and less you've seen. Idealistically great equality you have not seen, and for the reason that if you try to compress it beyond a point, you're just going to get flight of capital and people living, and you're going to squash your economy altogether. But within that range, you have seen differences, and I can give examples from the country I grew up in and have known for a very long time. Indian inequality. India during the colonial period was extremely unequal, as you would expect. Immediately after independence, India's early rhetoric is a lot of it is socialist rhetoric. But the socialism that India was talking about really is social democracy. That it is not that you capture the businesses and bring everything under state control, but you have a form of redistribution. And early India, the taxation occasionally went very, very high. You had inequality, but if you look at neighboring countries like Pakistan on one side and other Middle Eastern countries and all the Asian countries, Philippines, elsewhere, India was nowhere near that. A lot of inequality, but much less. After the liberalization of the Indian economy in 1991, India was beginning to grow faster, but inequality was also rising. And now inequality in India has gone very high. It's like among the highest inequality. So countries have gone through these kinds of inequality cycles. And across countries, if you look at Latin America, Costa Rica stands out as doing better than many other countries, small countries, if you look at. So I feel a certain amount of compression can be done within the country. Again, a lot of attention has to go into design. So a politician coming in with a hammer and trying to bring in greater inequality will do greater damage. And I feel a lot of the early Marxist interventions, full of good intentions, very poorly done, and you've ended up doing more damage. But it can be done intelligently. And fortunately, in the United States, occasionally you meet very super rich people who have ideas that I've done what the system allows, but there are ways in which you can do where I would not be able to amass quite as much. And we need to think in terms of how we design. But again, I'm going back to your first thing, that what you can do within a country is, of course, has very severe limitations. It has to be global.
We're at the end of our time here today. This was a wonderful conversation. Professor Basu, are there any closing thoughts that you would like to share with our group?
Not really. If you had told me earlier, I would have earlier thought of a closing thought, but I come with thoughts.
This is the surprise test paradox.
Yeah. Yeah, no, thank you very much. It's absolutely fascinating for me, actually, engaging in this manner. My usual conversations are with economists where it'll be one equation which will be stuck in the head, and you just talk about that. Thank you very much.
This is how we do it. We see if ideas survive the conversation. I always say that this is what differentiates us from TED. We see if when the speaker comes off the stage, if his or her ideas still stand at the end of the conversation. I think your book has won.
And I have taken away ideas. As I said, I've got a project now on working on constitutions and agreements and authoritarianism. So
I'd love to discuss that further.
Very,
I
very
think about this all the time. This is like how I spend my weekends thinking about it. And we're also going to be doing an event middle of October. We don't yet know the date. It's going to be an offline event in Manhattan on power. And I want to do 3 it's absolutely wonderful speakers and panelists. It's not going to be about the election, but it's going to be about the general idea. And I want to do 3 panels, one on charm. So for instance, Julia Zonavant, who was my classmate at university, will come to talk about, she has a book coming out at Princeton University Press on authoritarian leaders. And I think you will be very interested. There will be a panel on authority. And we will talk a little bit about experts, elites, education. Merve Emre, for instance, from Wesleyan will be there. And then there will be one about God and kind of secular religions and religious revival and how that interacts with populism. I will send you more details. It would be amazing if you could join us. I'm really, really curious what we will cook up. It's going to be a bunch of people who don't agree with each other. And good wine. So that's how I contribute.
And after some time, they won't know they are disagreeing.
It's true, or that they agree. That's the best. They come, they're like, la, 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 and you're like, actually, you're saying the same thing.
Could I ask quickly, what is the book that you guys are referring to? I'm sorry, I came in late. I for some reason had this idea that it was.
I will share that's Kaushik's book. I will share with you.
In August.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, so reason to be happy, it's already out in the UK, so some people might have read it already, and it'll be out in the US on August 6th. So anyone who hasn't read it, I encourage you to do so. I reread several sections multiple times.
It's incredible. The world needs this, so we will do our best to popularize it further.
And generally, these discussions and all are worthwhile in the end. One hopes that there are ideas that will come out of these. Thank you for doing this.
Thank you again for sharing your Saturday with us. And yeah, the recording will be available shortly. Thank you all for joining.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.